October 23, 1942, late night in the North African desert. At first, it doesn't feel like a battle. It feels like the earth itself is malfunctioning. A German soldier lies low in a shallow trench west of El Alamein, pressed into sand that's still warm from the day. He's not listening for engines. He's not watching for flares. He's just trying to make his body smaller, like that could help. Then the desert detonates. Not a few guns. Not scattered shells. A full wall of fire. So wide and so perfectly timed, it doesn't sound like shots anymore. It sounds like pressure, like the ground is getting crushed. This is the opening of the Second Battle of El Alamein, and the number that matters hits like a punch. 882. 882 British artillery pieces firing together across roughly 12 miles of front. Not a random storm. A planned sequence. Targets assigned, timetables set, shells arriving in patterns. For about 15 minutes, the desert becomes a brutal math problem, solved in steel. German officers who had seen hard fighting before would later describe it as something different. Not emotional, not frantic, more like an experiment carried out with cold patience, the kind of precision that makes you feel like your choices don't matter anymore. And here's the twist. 6 weeks earlier, senior American commanders didn't think the British were capable of this. Not because Britain lacked weapons. The British had plenty of gear. The Americans doubted something else, something harder to measure. They doubted the British had the nerve to attack. To understand that attitude in Washington, you have to back up to June 21st, 1942. Tobruk. Tobruk was supposed to be a fortress. It had held out for months before. It had become a symbol, a place people believed would not just fall. Then it did. In barely more than a day, tens of thousands of British and Commonwealth troops surrendered to Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps and its Axis partners. Tobruk wasn't just a loss of ground. It looked like a collapse of confidence. When the news reached the United States, it landed badly. American planners weren't in a mood to sugarcoat anything. The U.S. was ramping up for a global war, building a modern army at top speed, and looking at Britain as the experienced partner, supposedly the one that already knew how to fight Germany. Tobruk made it look like the experienced partner was tired. In the highest level meetings, the reaction was less pity and more calculation. If Britain couldn't hold a fortified position in North Africa, how was it going to stop Rommel from driving toward Egypt and the Suez Canal? Inside the U.S. Army's planning culture, the criticism got sharper. American staff officers reviewed recent British operations and saw a pattern they didn't like: withdrawals, defensive lines, evacuations. Even when Britain fought well, it often looked like it was fighting to survive rather than fighting to break the enemy. And the list of defeats was long. Forced out of France, setbacks in Greece and Crete, serious losses in Asia to Japan, Singapore especially, which hit Allied prestige like a wrecking ball. In North Africa, British offensives had stumbled more than once, sometimes gaining ground only to pay heavily for it and lose the advantage. Then came July 1942. Auchinleck's stand at El Alamein. The British stopped Rommel's advance. That was real. That mattered. But from an American perspective, the ending looked familiar. Britain held, but didn't destroy. Rommel was checked, but not finished. To American eyes, that was the story again. Brave defense, limited follow-through. So by August 1942, a judgment settled into place inside parts of the U.S. military establishment. Britain could still fight, but it could no longer deliver a clean offensive victory against a dangerous enemy. That belief wasn't just tactical. It turned into something like a diagnosis, an assumption that years of war had worn down the British Army's aggressive edge, that Britain by itself could not push Rommel out of Africa. And if that assumption was true, then the solution was obvious. The Allies would open a second front in North Africa from the west, Operation Torch, with Americans playing the leading role. American leadership, American planning, American momentum. The British could support, but they wouldn't be the spear. That was the mood when Bernard Montgomery took command of the British 8th Army in August 1942. From the American viewpoint, Montgomery didn't look like the guy to change everything. His reputation suggested a careful commander, strong on organization and morale, but not the type to gamble big in a fast-moving offensive. So the expectation was simple. Montgomery would dig in at El Alamein, keep Rommel out of Egypt, and wait for Torch to change the strategic balance. What they didn't expect was that Montgomery wasn't preparing to hold. He was preparing to deliver a kind of attack the desert had not seen. When Montgomery arrived at 8th Army headquarters on August 13, 1942, he didn't behave like a commander who was improvising week to week. He acted like someone already building a schedule. He looked at time. He looked at conditions. He locked onto a date window. Late October. The point wasn't romance or superstition, it was control. He wanted nights long enough for concealment. He wanted predictable weather. He wanted the kind of preparation that takes away surprises, not for him, but for the enemy. Over the next 10 weeks, he built Operation Lightfoot. That name sounds like speed, like tanks racing through the dust. But the concept underneath was the opposite of flashy. It was systematic. Montgomery's core idea wasn't to outfox Rommel in a dramatic dash. It was to turn the battlefield into a controlled process, one that crushed German options step by step. A major piece of that was artillery. Earlier British attacks in North Africa often used artillery in a more traditional way. Bombard a bit, then support your own infantry. Guns tied to divisions, fires that were strong in places, uneven in others. Montgomery's staff went for something far more centralized and deliberate, a single coordinated fire plan, timed phases, specific target sets, a rolling barrage designed to move forward by schedule, not by emotion. That kind of plan demanded extreme discipline, survey work, calibration, careful timing, and ruthless attention to detail. If you mess it up, you hit your own troops. If you get it right, you don't just damage trenches. You break the enemy's ability to respond. At the same time, Montgomery supported a deception effort that worked on a simple goal, not hiding that an attack was coming. Rommel knew that, but hiding where the main punch would land and when the real commitment would happen. Dummy equipment, fake activity, signals meant to draw attention south while the main pressure gathered elsewhere. To some American observers, all of this looked like overthinking. They saw preparation and assumed hesitation. They saw planning and assumed fear. If you're into WWINO's history and you want more stories where the planning is just as deadly as the fighting, subscribe now and keep the notifications on, because this next part is where the assumptions get punished. By mid-October, the American prediction machine felt confident. Montgomery would attack. The plan would hit reality. The attack would bog down. Rommel would counterpunch. The British would fall back into prepared lines again, and Torch would be the real turning point. Then the night of October 23rd arrived, 9:40 p.m. The first massive barrage slammed down across the German positions. A German defender later described the feeling in blunt terms. They had expected an attack, but they hadn't expected something so organized it felt like it couldn't be escaped. Not fire, but a system. Not chaos, but order. Shells did not simply hit. They arrived in sequence. Wire, forward trenches, support areas, artillery zones, like a checklist being completed. And when the defenders tried to answer back, the problem wasn't courage. It was targeting. When the whole horizon is flashing, what do you shoot at? At first, German troops did what doctrine trained them to do. Brace, survive the bombardment, then meet the infantry with machine guns and call for their own artillery. Because usually, when the barrage lifts, the fight starts. But this barrage didn't end. It moved. It walked forward, hundreds of meters at a time, onto the places German reserves would use to rally, onto the routes they'd take to counterattack, onto the positions where the defense was supposed to regain control. The plan wasn't just to smash the front line, it was to smash the active recovery. And out there in the darkness, right behind that moving wall of explosions, British infantry began to step off the line, heading into minefields and machine gun fire, trusting that the math in the sky would keep the enemy's head down just long enough. Because if that timing held, Rommel's army wouldn't get a clean moment to respond. And if it didn't hold, then the desert was about to swallow thousands of men on both sides. Dawn came on October 24th, and the battlefield did not look broken through. It looked shredded. The British had moved forward in places, but not in one clean surge. The Germans were still in the fight. Sections of the line held. Some strong points that should have been crushed by the bombardment were still spitting fire at close range. This was the moment many outside observers expected the whole British attack to stall out and die, because that's what had happened before in North Africa. The British hit, met stubborn resistance, lost rhythm, and then the momentum leaked away. But this time, Montgomery had built the plan around a hard assumption. The enemy would not cooperate, so when the advance slowed, it didn't cause panic. It triggered the next step. The artillery plan had teeth people didn't fully appreciate at first. Not just the giant opening barrage, but the follow-on system behind it. A major feature was reserve firepower, hundreds of guns that were not committed in the first wave. They were held back for exactly this situation, when infantry ran into machine gun nests, buried positions, or unexpected strongpoints. So instead of the attack freezing while commanders argued about what to do, fresh batteries were redirected onto newly identified targets. That mattered because German defense in North Africa relied on a rhythm of its own. The Germans liked to let an attacker crash into a defensive crust, get disorganized, and then get hit by a mobile counterattack. Armor coming in fast, striking flanks, wrecking supply lines, and turning a push into a retreat. That system needed three things to work: minefields and defenses that channel the enemy into predictable lanes, artillery and anti-tank guns that punish those lanes, mobile reserves that can move freely, and counterattack at the right moment. Montgomery's method went after all three. First, the minefields. On paper, Rommel's mine belts were supposed to be a cage. British armor would be forced into corridors, and those corridors would become killing zones. But the British didn't try to smash through in one dramatic gap. Engineers and infantry worked through the night and into the next day, cutting and clearing multiple passages. Not one, not two, 14. That number changed the entire geometry of the battlefield. If you can only break a mine belt in one spot, the defender can guess where you'll go and pile forces there. If you break it in 14 places, the defender can't seal everything at once. Second, the German guns. Rommel did not have the artillery weight to trade evenly. He had roughly 200 guns available against the British 882. That isn't a close contest. It's a different category of fight. German batteries that tried to stand still got targeted. Batteries that tried to move to survive lost their ability to deliver consistent fire. Either way, the defense couldn't settle into a stable rhythm. Third, the mobile reserves. Even when the Germans wanted to counterattack, movement became a nightmare. British air power punished daytime travel. At night, the minefields, once a strength, became a trap, especially once the battle disrupted the carefully planned routes. Units that needed to shift quickly were now boxed in by their own defenses, with British artillery watching the exits. So the Germans were not exactly routed early on. They were pinned. They were forced to react in slow motion while the British method kept applying pressure. By October 26th, 3 days into the offensive, the maps did not show a flashy victory. The British had advanced only a few miles. The front line was still thick with resistance, and that's where American skepticism started to flare again. From a distance, this looked like the classic pattern: hard fighting, limited ground gained, no clean breakthrough. To a U.S. staff mindset that valued decisive movement, it was easy to think, here we go again. If you only measure success by how far the line moves, El Alamein could look unimpressive, But Montgomery wasn't measuring it that way, because what he was really grinding down was not just men and tanks. He was grinding down the enemy's options. This is the part that gets missed when people talk about breakthrough like it's the only way to win. Rommel's defense depended on mobility, being able to shift, concentrate, counterpunch, and relocate before the enemy could lock him in place. Montgomery's plan treated mobility like a resource that could be exhausted. Every day the battle continued, Rommel burned fuel he couldn't easily replace. Every counterattack consumed ammunition and spare parts that weren't arriving fast enough. Every time he reinforced one sector, he weakened another sector. Every move carried a cost, and the British kept making those costs higher. That's why the British pressure didn't have to be cinematic. It just had to be constant. By late October, the Germans were still fighting hard, but they were fighting inside a problem that was shrinking around them. The mine belts narrowed safe movement. The artillery dominated those narrow corridors. Air power punished daylight travel. And British infantry, advancing behind planned fire support, kept the entire front under stress, making it difficult for the Germans to pull forces off the line to create a strong, clean counterattack. This is how a mobile defense becomes less and less mobile, not with one dramatic collapse, more like a machine losing parts until it can't function. And then the fuel situation started to show its teeth. By November 1st, German staff records and later accounts described the same brutal reality. The fuel supply was not just low, it was turning into a countdown, fuel for a few days, then less again. At a certain point, the defender faces an impossible choice. Do you spend fuel fighting, or do you save fuel retreating? Because you can't do both. That is what attrition looks like when it's aimed at logistics, not headlines. And as the fuel vanishes, something else vanishes with it. Confidence. German doctrine prized initiative, officers improvising and adapting fast. That style works best when the battlefield has openings, when you can move quickly, and when you can surprise the enemy. Montgomery's system tried to deny those openings, not by guessing what Rommel would do next, but by making next moves harder to execute at all. From the German side, it started to feel like fighting inside a closing space. The room to maneuver kept shrinking. Routes got watched. Assembly areas got hit. Repair points became targets. The battle began to punish the attempt to act. And meanwhile, back in American circles, the interpretation often lagged behind what was happening on the ground. Many U.S. observers were still looking for the big moment when the British either broke through or got thrown back. But that big moment wasn't really the point. The point was that Rommel's army was being stripped of its ability to operate as Rommel's army. Then came the number that made the situation undeniable. Early on November 2nd, 1942, around 1:15 hours, word reached the German command structure that the Africa Corps had only 17 operational tanks left. 17. Just a few days earlier, the count had been 278, and that drop did not come from one glorious movie-style tank duel. It came from the cumulative effect of pressure, vehicles damaged and not repaired fast enough, fuel and parts running short, workshops disrupted, supply columns threatened, and constant fire that made normal battlefield reset impossible. By this stage, even the Germans could see what kind of battle they were in. The British weren't trying to win by being faster. They were trying to win by making the enemy slower until fast wasn't available anymore. And now Montgomery was ready to deliver the next shove. Because once the defender is low on fuel and low on usable armor, the battlefield stops being a contest of tactics and starts being a contest of survival. On November 2nd, Montgomery prepared to launch Operation Supercharge, not just another push for ground, a focused punch designed to break the enemy where the consequences would be irreversible. And on the German side, commanders understood immediately that if the British hit the right place at the right time, the Africa Corps wouldn't just be beaten, it would be immobilized. By the time the sun rose, men on both sides could feel it. The battle was about to tip from grinding pressure into a final desperate test, because when an army is down to its last tanks and its last fuel, the next attack isn't just another day of fighting. It's the moment you either escape or you get locked in place forever. Operation Supercharge began with a simple truth on both sides. This was no longer a contest of clever moves. It was a contest of what was left. Montgomery's earlier phases had chewed the battlefield down like a grinder. Mine belts opened in multiple places, artillery controls centralized, German movement restricted, fuel and repair capacity squeezed day after day. Now he was ready for the shove that would end the argument. Supercharge was aimed at a sector where a breakthrough would matter beyond the front line, not grab ground for the map, but break the Axis ability to keep defending as a mobile force. That meant pushing through, forcing the last reserves to commit, and making the German position unravel in a way it could not patch over. On the German side, commanders understood the danger immediately. When you're down to scraps of armor and your fuel is running out, you can't afford a clean penetration. You can't afford to lose a route. You can't afford to have your remaining tanks destroyed in a rushed counterattack. But what else do you do? If you do nothing, the pressure keeps tightening until retreat becomes impossible. So the Germans committed what they had left. And what they had left was almost nothing compared to what they had started with. That is what made Supercharge so decisive. Not that the British suddenly became faster or bolder. It's that the earlier system had already set the conditions where the defenders' choices were bad choices. German counterattacks still happened. They still fought hard. Units still tried to build a line to stop the push, to create a moment where they could regain control. But the same problems kept showing up like a wall. British artillery dominated the areas where Axis forces needed to gather. British air power punished movement and resupply. Minefields and destroyed routes made quick shifts harder, and British infantry, moving with planned support, kept steady pressure so the Germans could not pull away cleanly to rebuild. The Germans were still dangerous. They were just losing the freedom that made them deadly. By the afternoon of November 2nd, the German defense was no longer about winning El Alamein. It was about buying time for withdrawal. That is a big psychological break. You can feel it inside an army when the goal changes from stop them to save what we can. German command and control began to fray. Vehicles and radios were destroyed. Units fought in pockets. Orders struggled to travel. The battlefield started behaving like a machine that had lost its wiring. And at the center of it, senior German leaders were pushed to the edge. One of the most important captures of the battle came during this phase. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, a key armored commander, was taken prisoner. That alone tells you how close to the surface the German command structure had been forced. Senior leaders were no longer directing from secure, stable positions. They were exposed because the situation demanded it. By this point, the German tank situation was catastrophic. It wasn't just the tanks had been knocked out. It was that the system that makes tanks useful, fuel, repair, recovery, parts, and time, had been crushed by sustained pressure. When that infrastructure collapses, the battlefield changes. Armor stops being a maneuver tool and becomes a stranded object. That is exactly what Montgomery's method had been built to produce. Then came the moment of decision. Hitler issued stand-fast style demands, the kind that sound strong on paper but ignore what the battlefield is actually doing. Rommel faced the real math. He could fight and lose the last of his force, or he could retreat and keep enough of an army to exist tomorrow. Rommel chose withdrawal. By November 4th, the Axis line was breaking into a full retreat westward, not a neat, calm pullback, but a forced movement away from a front that could no longer be held. That retreat didn't end in a day. It rolled across Libya and finally into Tunisia, with the British maintaining pressure as supply lines stretched farther and farther. This is the part where the American story and the German story start to diverge, because in American planning circles, El Alamein was not supposed to happen like this. The U.S. expectation had been Britain would defend, Torch would attack. American offensive power would be the turning point. But El Alamein forced a new reality. Rommel had been beaten before Torch even opened its western door. The U.S. still launched Operation Torch in November 1942, landing in Morocco and Algeria. That mattered strategically. It put Axis forces under pressure from two directions. It eventually helped close the trap in Tunisia. But Torch did not create Rommel's retreat. El Alamein did. And the contrast got sharper as events unfolded. American forces in North Africa quickly learned that landing troops is not the same thing as running a campaign. They ran into resistance, command friction, and supply problems. They also found out painfully that aggressive attacks without full readiness can get you smashed. That lesson hit hardest at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, when U.S. forces suffered a major defeat against experienced German units. It wasn't because Americans lacked courage. It was because modern war punishes gaps in preparation, coordination, and logistics, especially against an enemy who knows how to exploit them. Meanwhile, British forces under Montgomery kept moving from the east, still applying pressure, still keeping the Axis on the back foot. Eventually, the Axis position in Tunisia collapsed, and large numbers of German and Italian troops surrendered in May 1943. Here is what makes this story uncomfortable for the simple version many Americans grew up with. A clean American-centered narrative says, Britain held the line in Egypt, then America arrived, and the Axis lost North Africa. But the German accounts don't read that way. German reports, post-war interviews, and memoirs repeatedly return to the same point. The turning point in the desert was El Alamein, where the British didn't just survive, they executed. German veterans described a change in the British approach. Earlier in the war, the British were often seen as brave but predictable, hard to crush, but easier to anticipate. At El Alamein, the feeling changed to something closer to disorientation, not because British troops suddenly became superhuman, because the British plan removed the space for German improvisation. That matters because German doctrine valued initiative and adaptation. It assumes chaos. It expects openings. It depends on the ability to move, concentrate, and strike. Montgomery's method targeted that system directly. He didn't try to out-improvise Rommel. He tried to reduce the battle to a series of problems that could be solved in sequence. Mines, guns, movement, fuel, repair, reserves. When you treat warfare like a system, you don't need a cinematic breakthrough on day one. You need sustained control of the process. And that is what Rommel's force ran out of, the ability to keep the process alive. This is also why American observers struggled to interpret what they were seeing in late October. The U.S. tradition leaned toward aggressive maneuver, bold exploitation, and seizing momentum. That style can be effective, especially when the enemy is already weakening and you have major material advantages. But El Alamein highlighted a different kind of power: coordinated fire, planned logistics, controlled pressure, and the discipline to keep the fight methodical, even when it's slow and ugly. In the desert, methodical did not mean timid. It meant irreversible. If you want the sharpest summary of El Alamein, it's this. The British didn't win by being more daring than Rommel. They won by making daring less relevant. They built a battle where the defender's best habits, mobility, counterattack, quick adjustment, were steadily stripped away. Day after day, the German options narrowed until the only choice left was retreat. So why does this story often feel smaller in American memory than it was on the ground? Because it's not naturally a Hollywood plot. There's no single heroic dash that instantly ends the war. There's no clean, photogenic breakthrough that fits into one dramatic scene. It's grinding, engineered, and disciplined. It's a victory made of staff work, calibration, mind clearing, coordination, and pressure that doesn't let up. That kind of victory is harder to sell. And the people who write popular history usually choose the story that feels best, not the one that feels most accurate. In the American public story of World War II, the headline moments become the ones with a clear visual: D-Day, the Bulge, island landings in the Pacific. El Alamein often gets reduced to a holding action, like it was just a stubborn defense that kept Rommel busy until America arrived. But ask the Germans who fought it what changed the war in North Africa, and the answer points back to that night in October when 8082 guns turned the desert into a schedule of destruction. El Alamein showed something that U.S. leaders in August 1942 didn't think Britain could still do. It showed that Britain could attack successfully, not by charging harder, but by planning deeper. It proved that offensive warfare is not only about speed or aggression. It can be about building a system that the enemy can't escape. And that's the real correction to the early American prediction. U.S. generals looked at Britain's recent defeats and assumed the will and ability were gone. They weren't crazy to think it. The record looked bleak. But El Alamein revealed a different reality. A British army that learned from failure, changed its methods, and, under the right leadership, could deliver a professional, sustained offensive against one of Germany's most respected commanders. In other words, the British didn't win because they suddenly became more American. They won because they became more systematic. And that is why El Alamein matters. Not as a footnote, not as a placeholder before Torch, but as the battle that broke the Axis position in the desert and forced a retreat that never truly stopped until North Africa was lost. If you listen to the enemy's perspective, German testimony, German reporting, German memory, you get a story that doesn't flatter easy myths. You get a story where method beats improvisation, where preparation beats swagger, where victory is built, measured, and executed until the opponent runs out of moves. American commanders predicted British defeat. Then El Alamein happened, and the desert proved that the quiet, disciplined kind of offensive can be the deadliest kind of all.